Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. Russian President Putin claims he started this war in Ukraine to, in part, push NATO back from Russia's borders. He has spent the pandemic reading history and somehow reflecting on the idea that Russia should be the ruler of its neighbors, which broke away after the fall of the Soviet Union. A lot of Russians who have fled Russia in these dark days say all Putin really cares about is staying in power. But his willingness to threaten Europe and America with nuclear weapons now, and his invasion of Ukraine, has brought more foreign forces close to his borders to muscle up and reinforce NATO member countries. And Finland and Sweden, up until now neutral nations, are shaken by the Kremlin's imperial ambitions. So they are announcing that they will seek NATO membership. Nothing political about it. Polls show people fear Russia. They see NATO as the only way to protect their countries. So Putin, losing the fight in Ukraine, sacrificing his citizens to fight on with no promise of victory, now has more NATO than ever before. It's Putin and his security chief's legacy, and the clock won't easily be turned back. On this backstory, William Alberque on Russia's nuclear threat and what would happen if Putin launched a weapon. But first, Britain's former national security advisor on the conflict with Putin's Russia in Europe. All right, Sir Mark Lyall Grant is a former senior British diplomat who previously served as the UK's national security advisor, and he was also a permanent representative of the United Kingdom at the United Nations. Welcome back, Mr. Ambassador.
Hello, good morning.
Mark, first of all, I want to ask you, because it's just happened, and that is that, another big package for Ukraine, $40 billion, was stalled in the U.S. Senate yesterday, and U.S. Senator Rand Paul, eventually it may pass, but U.S. Senator Rand Paul said something to the effect of, I want to support Ukraine, but not at the cost of dooming the U.S. economy. And that plays into this kind of increasing discussion about inflation and gas prices, food prices. Do you think that the U.S. and Europe long-term have the stomach to carry on this campaign against Russia and support Ukraine?
Rand Paul has quite a history of being very skeptical about overseas aid in general. So I'm not entirely surprised that he's delayed the decision in the United States. I think it will pass in the next couple of days or so. But the wider question is, how long will this conflict go on? And does the West have the stomach to continue to support Ukraine as strongly as it has done, both economically, militarily, politically, for the foreseeable future? And I sense, certainly in Europe, that the answer is yes. A lot of the pain is being felt now economically by Western Europe in terms of inflation, interest rate rises, gas prices, inflation in the country as a whole. But I don't sense any lack of enthusiasm to support Ukraine going forward. On the contrary, I think in the United Kingdom in particular, there's a risk of being more Ukrainian than the Ukrainians in some of the rhetoric that the government has been using in recent days. So I think this is a big crisis on the back of COVID-19, but nonetheless, I sense that so egregious has been President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and every day we hear more about the brutality of the Russian forces, that I don't see any waning in that support for the foreseeable future.
Why has the United Kingdom been so out in front in terms of supporting Ukraine? Russia has even threatened the United Kingdom with a nuclear strike. Commentators on Russian television at night have talked about detonating a weapon and flooding Britain with radioactive waste. There's a lot of hostility towards the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom has passionately stepped up in terms of supplying weapons to Ukraine and other things. Why is that?
Well, it is certainly a deliberate government policy to be out in front of the Europeans. I think there's two reasons. The first is that Britain has traditionally played that role of being the anchor to windward, the spearhead, if you like, of more robust interventionism, playing a global role. And to ensure that the European Union as a whole pushes forward and takes the necessary decisions on sanctions, Britain wanted to show a very firm leadership role. But secondly, there is a post-Brexit element to this that is showing that Britain can still be an influential global player, despite having left the European Union a couple of years ago. So there's a political as well as a tactical reason why Britain is getting out in front. And I don't think the British government takes too seriously the Russian threats against the United Kingdom. Relations between the United Kingdom and Russia have not been business as usual ever since 2006 and the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko in London. So we're used to very difficult relations with Russia now, and I don't think what some of the sort of threats that have been made will worry the British government too much.
You know, Britain has even pledged military guarantees to Finland and Sweden as they've now stepped forward and said they're going to join NATO. And it could happen very quickly, but, you know, very quickly could be months. And Russia is talking about some kind of military step. I mean, it may just be that they're going to, you know, talk about nuclear weapons being pushed forward, although they've already been pushed forward in many places like Kaliningrad anyway. But what is the wisdom, do you think, of Finland and Sweden doing this, and you just kind of take it past the political discussion and say, if your population fears that Putin is going to push past Ukraine and threaten everybody in Europe, it's something they almost have to do.
Yes, I think the mood has changed very significantly in both Finland and Sweden because of this Russian aggression against Ukraine. Before the neutrality of Sweden in particular, which has been going for a couple of hundred years, Finland, it's more recent, only since 1940, was embedded in their psyche. But now, because of what's happened, I think they feel that probably the next correct step is to join NATO. And of course, NATO has always taken a position that any country of Europe that wishes to, of the West, that wishes to join NATO should be allowed to do so if they meet the necessary conditions. So I'm sure that NATO will welcome both Finland and Sweden. But there is no doubt that this is a massive strategic defeat for President Putin. I mean, one of the many unintended consequences of the invasion of Ukraine, because not only has he given NATO a renewed purpose, reinforced troop movements to Eastern Europe, closer to the Russian border, but now actually an expansion of NATO is in prospect, which would add 1,300 kilometers of direct NATO-Russia border, so something like 3 times what it currently is at the moment. So this is a very significant setback for Putin. On the other hand, despite, again, some of the rhetoric we've heard in the last couple of days, I'm not sure there's a huge amount that Russia can do militarily to prevent that happening. I mean, they've expanded a huge amount of effort and energy in Ukraine and are still bogged down. So in terms of a military threat against Finland, one would have to look, I think, more at cyber attacks and sort of low-level subversion than outright military attack against Finland or Sweden.
Do you think that President Putin is making rational decisions right now? Do you fear that some of these reports about him being sick may be true and that he's acting in many ways, some people would say irrationally, trying to threaten Europe, willing to destroy Europe and his own people for some kind of notion of restoring the empire?
I wouldn't go as far as to say he's acting irrationally. I think he's been very badly advised and was obviously completely underestimated the strength of the Russian army, but also underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian resistance and underestimated the strength and unity of the Western response. So he has made some huge strategic errors I wouldn't go as far as to say he's acting completely irrationally, but I do think, I've met President Putin in the past, but not in the last 4 or 5 years. But those who have met him recently do sense a change in him. Now, whether that is occasioned by some physical illness, there's been a lot of speculation about that. I don't know, frankly. But he clearly is not behaving as he used to do, and hence all the mistakes he's making.
Last question to you, Mark. Do you think that we may be guilty of overestimating success on the ground in terms of what Ukraine is able to do right now? Putin may be set for a very long war. And, I would ask you, how do you think this ends? But again, do you think we may be guilty of being a little overly positive in rooting for the Ukrainians to push Russia back when Russia's taking a lot of ground? They're holding ground. Places like Mariupol are not going to be easily reclaimed.
No, I agree. I think there is a risk of overestimating or having mission creep, as it were, increasing our ambitions for the outcome of this conflict. I think recently of comments by the British government suggesting that they want Russia to withdraw entirely from the whole of Ukraine, including the Crimea and the Donbas and Luhansk and Donetsk, which is not an objective of the current conflict that the Ukrainian government itself has established. So I think we need to be a little bit careful in not wish fulfillment in trying to expect Ukraine to do better militarily than it is capable of doing, even with the assistance of Western military equipment. The most likely outcome still, I think, is probably that Russia will eventually succeed in taking almost all of the Donbas and creating the bridge through Mariupol to the Crimea. And I would then expect President Putin to sit down and say, now let's negotiate about the rump of Ukraine, which is governed by Zelensky from Kyiv. So that still is the most likely outcome on the ground, despite the heroic efforts of the Ukrainian military. The Russians are making some progress and are likely to be able to consolidate control of the vast amount of the Donbas in eastern Ukraine.
So I've lied to you and said it was my last question. So if that's true, then where does that leave the Ukrainian leadership? Because Ukrainians will not easily accept Russia biting off that big chunk of the Donbas and the land bridge. Does that put us in some kind of insurgency that could go on for years, do you think? Or will the Ukrainians have to settle?
Well, I think there will be an ongoing conflict for many years, not at the level of intensity we're seeing at the moment. I don't think that level of intensity can continue for much more than a month or so on either side. But I do see a low-level frozen conflict, but not that frozen, rather as we've seen for the last 8 years, because we mustn't forget the Ukrainian soldiers have been losing their lives, every year for the last 8 years. Since 2014. And I don't see President Zelensky being able to accept that Russia has taken even more of the territory, despite having essentially failed in its main aims on the battlefield. But I do see a risk that President Zelensky will come under pressure from some in the international community, perhaps Turkey, perhaps France, perhaps Germany, to settle on what is essentially a bad and, in my view, unsustainable peace as a result of this conflict.
Sir Mark Lyall Grant, always a pleasure to talk to you, Mark. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Dana.
All right, at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, William Alberque is the Director of Strategy, Technology, and Arms Control, focusing on the proliferation of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Hi, William. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
So
Thank you for having me on the show.
You've just done a study on non-strategic weapons and the possibility of arms control. And am I framing that properly?
I've done a lot of studies just like that. Yes, indeed.
And what a lot of people don't realize, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I've done a lot of stories as a correspondent about strategic weapons, ballistic weapons, is that the arms control treaties do not include non-strategic, non-ballistic, or what they would call, feeder
Right.
tactical weapons. Right. And they probably far outnumber the nuclear weapons in terms of there are many more of those than there are ballistic missiles. Is that right? Ballistic warheads on missiles.
Right. So the Federation of American Scientists does the best unclassified analysis of the nuclear arsenals of all the different countries. And you would say with Russia, for instance, they're estimating more than 2,000 theater or tactical nuclear weapons as opposed to strategic weapons. Russia has, around 5,000 warheads total. So there's never been arms control, just as you point out, that covers non-strategic nuclear weapons. There's arms control between the US and Russia, dating back to the US and the Soviet Union, covering strategic weapons, which, as you point out, also usually covers the delivery systems. So the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the sub-launched ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles on heavy bombers that can reach the United States. This was all about what could hit the US and the Soviet Union. This carries over to the treaty that we know as New START, which is the only remaining nuclear treaty between the US and Russia, negotiated by Rose Gottemoeller in 2010, extended by the Biden administration, and it will end in 2026. But in the meantime, there's nothing that covers all the other weapons that are intended for theater or battlefield use.
Why is that so critical now when we start talking about threats of Russia to use nuclear weapons in terms of the Ukrainian conflict?
Well, the need to cover additional warheads goes all the way back to the end of the Cold War. At the end of the INF Treaty, the US and the Soviet Union were talking about entering into talks on short-range nuclear forces, but it just never got there because the Soviet Union collapsed. So when Russia went into sort of economic freefall in the 90s, the first thing they really reinvested money in the early 2000s was their nuclear arsenal. First, they wanted to maintain their deterrent with the United States, so they invested a lot in the strategic weapons, but the next target for them was tactical nuclear weapons. And so they've developed all these short range and intermediate range ballistic, cruise, and non-traditional trajectory weapons in order to deliver nuclear effects on the battlefield. It was a good place for them to invest because there's no arms control that covers it. And quite frankly, in the West, this is not something that we normally think about. We don't normally think about nuclear war fighting, but it's clear that Russia has been thinking about how to fight and win on the nuclear battlefield.
That sends a chill down my spine because in the current climate, that means that Russia has contemplated using a theater weapon, not a ballistic weapon, but a theater weapon in a conflict like Ukraine.
Well, if you go back to 1999, there was an exercise called Zapad, which means West. The Soviet Union used to have this exercise every couple of years. Russia picked it up in 99 after the collapse of the 90s, and they've been doing it since then about every 4 years. In Zapad 1999, they wanted to exercise a military concept to prevent what they thought the West wanted to do to Russia, the Yugoslav campaign, where we used cruise missiles to help topple the government in Belgrade. And so they thought that they would need to use nuclear weapons in the theater level to attack NATO and destroy NATO targets. And they exercised this very publicly in 1999. Now, the director of the Security Council in 1999, who reported to President Yeltsin the results of the Zapad exercise, was a colonel whose name you might know, Vladimir Putin. So this goes deep into Putin's history as well with how he thinks about conflict. He thinks of nuclear weapons as being very useful for deterrence, but also for coercion, and then again for nuclear warfighting. And it's clear that Russia has been building systems that don't really make a lot of sense for deterrence, but make a lot of sense for warfighting. And again, we've seen exercises since 1999, the Zapad exercise, the Kavkaz exercise, the Vostok exercise. These are the big directional Russian exercises that they stage. They often have a nuclear component to them, and sometimes they're exercising what we think are tactical warfighting scenarios with nuclear weapons.
What would you put the odds of Russia resorting to a nuclear weapon in Ukraine? And would they let me make it more complicated.
Yeah.
Would they think that they could carry out a limited nuclear strike without any kind of response from the West? And if the West contemplated a limited response, is there even such a thing under the terms of mutually assured destruction?
So these are all great questions. And I would say that mutually assured destruction is a concept that in the West we've tried to get away from. That's what missile defenses are about, is not having mutually assured destruction, but having the ability to defend yourself. And that really has sort of set off a wave of destabilization. I mean, that horse has unfortunately bolted, and now we see Russians developing weapon systems to try to defeat missile defense. But that's not really your question. Your question focusing on use scenarios in Ukraine. Let me be very clear. I sat down with experts, I looked into Russian doctrine, and I've thought about under what circumstances Russia would introduce nuclear weapons into the Ukraine context. They're vanishingly small. The idea that a tactical nuclear weapon will buy them an effect that would be useful in this war, there's just not many places to use them, because what a nuclear weapon is it's in the tactical sense, is it's just a very, very, very large bang. Ukraine isn't massing huge amounts of force. That's what you would use a tactical nuclear weapon to do, is to destroy a massed army that's coming after you. If there's 20,000 troops all massed together, you blow a nuclear weapon over them, they all die instantly. Not. Or you use a nuclear weapon to destroy a city, or you use it maybe for a demonstration strike, something like that. But there's no real good use, because Ukraine is using smaller units, they're using mobility, they're running through the forest, they're attacking at places of their choice, they're using special operations, they're using defensive lines. So there's not really a place where Russia needs to blow a nuclear weapon in order to break the Ukrainian line or to destroy their army. The only thing they really could use it for, I thought, when I thought through all the scenarios, would be a demonstration. So maybe they would set a nuclear weapon off, maybe over the center of the Black Sea after declaring, a no-fly zone and a NOTAM, notice to airmen to stay out of that zone, which we do for exercises all the time. And they set off a nuclear weapon low enough that it doesn't affect the atmosphere, high enough that it doesn't suck up all the water into a huge fallout cloud. And they say, see, we're just crazy enough to do it. But if they did that, now here's the thing. If Russia crosses the nuclear threshold, they are going to lose the support of countries that they rely upon, like India. Can you imagine India's reaction if Russia breaks the taboo over nuclear weapons use in combat that has existed since 1945? They have a very uneasy relationship. They're trying to think of how to navigate through this conflict, and they're helping Russia with trade, but they're also part of a broader non-aligned movement, which, in theory, even though India has nuclear weapons, wants to get rid of US and Russian nuclear weapons. Then all of a sudden Russia uses it. I think India would have to sever relations with Russia, at the very least stop trading with them, put Russia in a much more difficult position. I think the Chinese would say, what in the world did you just do? China has more of an interest in stability than they do in a Russian victory here. And Russian use of nuclear weapons would show them to be an agent of chaos. And I think even China would back away slowly and say, this is a little bit too far, because in the United Nations, Russia would be condemned. You saw the vote in the Human Rights Council where so many countries came together, or the vote on UN General Assembly condemning Russia's actions already in the crisis. How many more countries would join that condemnation? 160, 170? Russia would be more isolated. Russia would be so isolated that it would make Pyongyang look like Paris. I don't think they want to do that. And what would the West do in response? That's a great question. Would we have to do a tit for tat? Would we have to detonate a nuclear weapon? I don't think so. But would we have to respond? I think quite possibly. And so I could see a situation, as we did in Syria, where we identify the unit involved in the nuclear use and we strike that unit. But I think it would be conventional, because I think the US would have no interest in trying to climb the nuclear escalation ladder. I think they would want to send a signal that this is not acceptable. I think they would want to do it with other states, maybe the UK and France, again, as happened in Syria when there was a Syrian chemical weapons use. The three countries came together and fired cruise missiles, which hit near, to be fair, Russian forces were there with the Syrians as well. So I think there is precedent that the West would act in unison to condemn and to quite possibly retaliate, but on the conventional level. But again, you also have to consider that in
But
this
we're-
context, there'd
Retaliate,
be global
though, if I
condemnation.
can just jump in, retaliate on the launch platform that was used.
Correct. So, for instance, what would Russia use to? And again, you have to think very practically. It's very easy to say Russia would use nuclear weapons. Well, what do you mean? They would put them on an SS-26
sub
missile.
launch in the Caspian, or
Great. So, well, okay. Now, if it's a sub, so if they're going to launch a nuclear weapon from a submarine, you're talking about a sub-launched ballistic missile, which is part of their intercontinental strike force. So you would be talking about one of the submarines that we watch the most closely, loading an ICBM on it and firing that ICBM on Ukraine. That would cause immediate reaction from the United States, because as it launches, we would have no idea at first launch whether that's going to go intercontinental or whether that's going for a shorter target. So chances are Russia wouldn't want to use an intercontinental system. They'd either use an air-launched cruise missile from one of their bombers, or they would put it on an SS-26, the Iskander short-range dual-capable missile, or
one of these hypersonic weapons.
One of a hypersonic dual-capable weapon. I'm not sure which one, maybe Onyx or something like that. Yeah. So they would launch this missile, and they would have to launch it from somewhere, presumably from an aircraft or from a ground-launched missile. So then I think the United States, for instance, if it was an SS-26 launching from Belgorod in Russia, you would see maybe the US, UK, and France identify that unit that launched it and strike that unit with conventional cruise missiles, just to say, you did that, you're wrong, we're hitting you.
Inside Russia?
I think inside Russia, yeah, I do. I think a conventional strike, it would be hard then for Russia to say, you fired I had a nuclear weapon at Ukraine, you fired a conventional missile at me, it's the end of the world. You know what I mean? What would be their logic then in escalating further? I think that would actually end up sending a strong message that they can't goad us into nuclear use. We're not going to be reckless enough to cause World War III, but there has to be a cost for the use of a nuclear weapon.
So I think that William Alberque is not somebody who talks, kind of off the top of his head about this stuff. If you've already thought about this and you've given it considerable thought, it means that NATO countries have gamed this, and probably gamed it quite recently.
I wouldn't think that NATO has, but I think the United States has. I think the UK has. I think France has. I think the nuclear West has thought about what would happen if Russia used chemical weapons or biological weapons or nuclear weapons, and I think they've thought that I think they think that line would have to have a response beyond condemnation and more sanctions. But I think it would require a message that crossing that line fundamentally alters the conflict, and that for Putin, there's easier ways to kill yourself than to introduce nuclear weapons into war.
There was an assessment by the U.S. security advisors yesterday at a committee hearing where they said essentially that, as this war drags on, because they see it as a long conflict, and if Ukraine is successful in pushing the Russians back, whether it be to the northern border or into the Donbas or even pushing towards the Crimea, that they predict that the US thinks that you'll see more threats of nuclear weapons, and the possibility and danger of that use would increase. Do you agree with that?
I think that if Russia is faced with a strategic defeat in Ukraine, where the threat is they might lose Crimea, then I think you are talking about, some very dangerous scenarios, because Crimea is an incredibly important strategic port for the Russian Navy, and we believe that Crimea has facilities that can store nuclear weapons. So you'd be talking about a very critical base that, for all we know, might have nuclear weapons at it, nuclear warheads at it right now. I think they would, but even without nuclear warheads there, I think they see that as so central to, their access to warm water. Crimea has always been at the core of one of their war effort with Ukraine back to 2014, obviously, but even before that, the idea of a 99-year lease with Ukraine wasn't enough; they had to secure it permanently. So possibly, but I hate to say this, but I also think the chances of Ukrainian forces being able to destroy Russian forces in Crimea is relatively low. I think any war scenario ends with at best pushing them back to the February 24th border. But I just don't see them being able to seize Crimea. I think Russia would be able to win that, and they would use everything on the conventional level to win that. And if it did look like they were going to lose that, then maybe. I think with the rest, again, what's the use scenario? So if Ukraine is massing forces on the Crimean border and ready to storm across, maybe there's a nuclear use scenario that makes sense. But if you're talking about the entire border of Ukraine and Russian forces losing in Belgorod and Russian forces falling back on Donetsk and Luhansk, again, the idea of them using nuclear weapons in a combat situation, you're talking about fallout all across Europe. You're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of people dying. Russia crossing a taboo for what? That wouldn't suddenly defeat the Ukrainian army. That would make a radioactive area and some dead soldiers. But I think that would even further increase Ukrainian resolve to win. And again, I think this would make the West start talking about regime change in Russia. I think if Putin crosses the nuclear line, he puts a target on himself for the future. I think the world would see him as an illegitimate leader at that point. And I don't think any Pyrrhic victory in Ukraine is worth that.
I guess, it just strikes me after covering all these START negotiations, we think we got it right to some degree with restricting the number of weapons and slowly lowering the number of weapons deployed, on triad systems. But in fact, we've never dealt with tactical weapons, and there have never been any rules of the road and agreements on that countries would never use them. And it just seems to me we'll look back potentially, I hope not, but we'll look back potentially and say it was a critical error.
I think it was. Look, let's face it. At the end of the 1990s, the United States took its eye off the ball entirely on great power competition, and Russia could not wait to get back to parity with the United States. And so we ignored their tactical nuclear weapons entirely. They made a promise in 1991 and 1992, first Gorbachev and then Yeltsin, to reduce a large number of these weapon systems, but with absolutely no verification. We've heard Russian politicians say they never fulfilled, this is called the Presidential Nuclear Initiatives of 1991 and 1992. We've had Russian politicians say that they never fulfilled them. We have no verification, and we now know that they've gone back on very specific promises in there, specifically related to tactical nuclear weapons. And so the fact that we did not continue to treat Russia as a threat, as a potential adversary through the 2000s, on the one hand, legitimately, we wanted them to be a partner. We wanted them to be a normal country. But the fact is, Russia doesn't even see itself as a normal country. And so it was easy for the Bush administration, for instance. George W. Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw someone he could deal with, and then promptly ignored the guy for the next 8 years so he could go fight the global war on terror, which was an enormous waste of capital and energy and money for the United States, when we should have been looking at the world in a much more strategic way. As China and Russia saw the opportunities to catch up with us in many different ways. And tactical nuclear weapons is this amazing legacy that the Soviet Union has bequeathed to the Russians, and the Russians see this as a real treasure. And yes, I think we will regret that we didn't say, okay, we've got START 1 in place. Great, now let's do tactical and theater nuclear weapons. Instead, the Bush administration even abandoned the potential to extend the INF Treaty back in 2001. We had the opportunity to say, let's do another 10 years of inspections under the INF Treaty. But the Bush administration was so dead set against new arms control that they walked away, and they left that on the table. And the Russians just moved into that space, violated the INF, built all these systems developed to deliver short-range nuclear weapons. And now we're faced with this massive arsenal and, very little leverage to negotiate it away. But
and now we're faced with other countries that draw lessons from what's taking place. And Ukraine was a country that gave up nuclear weapons in the 90s, and North Korea and others will say, we'll never give up nuclear. Iran, if they're able to, achieve a real arsenal of nuclear weapons, will say they'll never give up nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but I mean, the best way to shore up the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons right now is to ensure that Russia is seen to have been defeated in its war aims in Ukraine, is seen by the world to not have triumphed. Because then the question is, well, okay, but Russia literally has more nuclear warheads than even the United States, and Ukraine kicks them all over the map. what's the point of having nuclear weapons if a non-nuclear weapons state can fundamentally destroy your war aims and preserve its sovereignty? Do you know what I mean? So that there's the possibility. I think if Ukraine loses and is seen to lose and is seen to suffer from a coercive loss, then you're absolutely right. Countries will say the sine qua non of security is nuclear weapons. I hope that's not the case, and I hope that the lesson is Russia got its butt kicked, quite frankly, just like the US got its butt kicked in Vietnam. North Vietnam didn't have nuclear weapons. We had all the nuclear weapons. Even in Korea, we had nuclear weapons. At that time, China didn't have nuclear weapons. And so, the lesson should be that nuclear weapons are very good at establishing deterrence with another nuclear weapons state, but it doesn't actually provide you with coercive outcomes. At least, there's few, if any, examples where a nuclear weapons state is able to achieve aims purely through nuclear coercion.
You spent years at NATO. What would you say now about Finland and Sweden, after being neutral countries for all these years, look like that they will now join NATO out of fear of Russia?
This fundamentally transforms Baltic security. And I mean, if you just look at a map of the Baltic region, one of the biggest challenges in NATO in defending the Baltics is how do you defend Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia that are right here on the Russian and Belarusian border? It's a very complicated task to get enough force in there to defend those three countries, especially with Kaliningrad right here dividing Poland from Lithuania. Now, if suddenly Finland is a NATO member, they have long-range artillery. They can strike Russian supply lines and forces as they mass to invade the Baltics. Plus, Russia now has to worry about Finnish forces, which are right at the entrance to St. Petersburg, and also Finnish forces up here near the Kola Peninsula, which is one of the biggest Russian nuclear submarine bases. So in a crisis, suddenly Russia, instead of thinking that this is a free border where they can pull troops away, now has to put troops up here in a crisis to defend in case Finland gets mad and decides to take back some of their territory that they lost in World War II, which they have never forgotten. So basically, Finland and Sweden joining NATO makes the Baltic Sea a NATO sea, and it makes Russia's seizure of the Baltic states almost impossible from a military planning and execution point of view. And especially with what we've seen in Ukraine, a highly motivated, well-armed and technologically advanced Finland could hand Russia their hat. And if they're part of the NATO alliance, well, I think that increases peace and security in the Baltic region and actually makes future conflicts in that whole region of Europe much less likely.
In the long term, but in the short term, the reaction from Russia could be quite severe.
I think what they're going to do is they're going to announce a bunch of things as though they were new measures for things that they've already done. Like, for instance, we know that they have nuclear weapons storage in Kaliningrad. They're going to say, we will now put nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad. And everyone who's studied this will be like, yeah, we know that. We're going to put more cruise missiles in the region. But honestly, like, you look at this border, where's Russia going to get the troops from for new additional basing? They've had to pull troops out from Central Asia and out from the Far East just to fight Ukraine. They're stretched a little bit thin right now, and under the economic constraints that they suffer from, I think they're going to make a lot of noise in a very brief period of time. And then once membership is totally settled, I think that whole region just goes back to sleep, because Russia doesn't want to hit you where you're strong. They want to hit you where you're weak. So once that whole front is secured, I think Russia moves on and tries to find another way to undermine the West. It ain't going to be through the Baltics.
William Alberque, thank you so much for your time, and it's great to talk to you.
Dana, thank you.
And that's our backstory on the fallout from the war in Ukraine. This is such a significant conflict. It can potentially shape Europe for decades to come. And Russia, isolated, a pariah state, is pressing the war. Putin hell-bent for escalation. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Please share it, and I'll talk to you again soon.